Hey y'all, it's Miss Welch. Today's video is about muscular and nervous tissue. So two of the general categories of tissues. We'll look at their major characteristics and functions overall as a category, and then look at specific types of each, their functions and locations in the body. So let's get started. Now remember that there are four main classes of tissues in the body. There's epithelials, connective, muscle, and nervous. So this video is going to focus on muscle and nervous. So let's just start with muscle and think about its overall function in the body. It's pretty easy. It's movement, right? It doesn't matter whether you're talking about voluntary movements as you exercise or involuntary movements like your heartbeat or digestion. Those are all movement, so they all have to have muscle tissue. Now let's think about the structure of that muscle tissue. It changes, of course, based on subtype, but in general, it has a lot of cells packed together in a very organized fashion, very parallel. You'll see that when you look at the micrographs, that muscle tissue cells are arranged in very long, thin, parallel strips. So it's kind of in between epithelial and connective. Epithelials are very compacted and you see cell, right? But not necessarily in long parallel sections. Connective tissue, you have lots of cells, but they have space in between them. They have all that ground substance and fibers and extracellular matrix. So the cells are scattered. Muscle is going to look very parallel, very compacted, but even the extracellular space is going to kind of show that cellular structure. You're still going to see a lot of nuclei instead of lots of fibers or something like you might in connective. And that is because you want all the muscle cells to kind of react in the same way, right? You want them to make motion in the same direction. So your muscle cells are all parallel so that they can function as one giant unit. All right, let's start with skeletal muscle. This is a micrograph of skeletal muscle tissue. And so how do you know? Well, it's easy to see it's muscle because of those long parallel lines. So you see these long red parallel strips that let you know it's skeletal muscle. You see these nuclei, and skeletal muscle have some interesting features of the nuclei. Number one, they're pushed off to the periphery. They're not in the center of each cell. Because there's a lot of protein fibers in there for contraction that take up all the space. Also, each of these skeletal muscle cells could have more than one nucleus, so they are multinucleated, and that helps with contraction happening all at the same time across large expanses of muscle tissue. So that might not be apparent on the actual micrograph, those differences, but one thing you can see are these striations. So do you see all these little tiny hatch marks up and down that go the opposite direction of the parallel lines, right? Perpendicular. All those little tiny lines are called striations. They're created by the patterning of the protein fibers, the actin and myosin, inside that cell. And that pattern arrangement of actin and myosin can actually be visualized under the microscope with those hash marks or striations. I think it looks like a bendy straw. You know, that little section of the straw that bends? That's what it reminds me of, is little bendy straw that's squished together. Remember, skeletal muscle is voluntary. That is your actual muscle movement of your bones. So skeletal muscle are all those muscles you can name, like your biceps and triceps and quads, gluteus maximus. Those are all skeletal muscle tissue that is voluntary and can be used to move the body around. Now this is smooth muscle. So to me, I can almost imagine it being smooth, right? It just looks like a smooth sheet. You can kind of see the parallel structure, right? Everything kind of looks lined up. If you remember, dense connective tissue also looks very similar to this, but it does not have as many nuclei. So that's one way you can see the difference. Sometimes it's a little wavier too, but definitely there's more nuclei here because these are packed in individual cells with the nuclei. Now, smooth muscle is single nucleated. There's only one nucleus per cell as opposed to the skeletal muscle. There's no striations, so that you don't see those hash marks. And there's no T-tubules or transverse tubules, which are important in contraction. Smooth muscle contracts a little differently than skeletal muscle does. Where do you find smooth muscle in the body? It is involuntary. You do not tell smooth muscle to move. So places that have to contract without your permission, basically. So think about the walls of the stomach, the intestines, the bladder, places that contract on their own by involuntary motions of the body. Blood vessels, there's a ring inside each blood vessel to help dilate or constrict those blood vessels. Last but not least, this is cardiac muscle tissue. So it kind of has a middle ground of features between skeletal and smooth. It's kind of a mix. So you see the parallel lines, right? You see parallel lines. It's got a little more space in it, and a lot of times that is due to the way it's dissected and mounted for these slides. You see that space in these white spaces. But look at this. You see how it's kind of parallel together, and then it kind of branches off. You get some sections here, or right here, where it's kind of straight, and then whoop, there's a branch sideways. These are called intercalated discs, and this is a special feature of cardiac muscle tissue because you want your heart to beat all at the same time. So all those cells have to be able to communicate quickly with each other with passing ions and electrolytes. And so there are intercalated discs or branching connections between the muscle cells. There's also only single nuclei in the cells, like smooth muscle, but like skeletal muscle, there are striations. So I think it's a little hard to see in this micrograph, but there are those striated sections of the muscle where it looks like that perpendicular hash marks inside each of the cells. So where do you find cardiac muscle? Only in the heart. It is involuntary and makes up that myocardium, the layer of the heart that is made of muscle for muscular contraction. It is not in the blood vessels. So this is one that people mess up. You think cardiac, you think, okay, well, it must be everything that has to deal with cardiovascular. It is just in the heart. As I mentioned just a second ago, the muscle inside blood vessels that would allow arteries and veins to dilate and constrict is the smooth muscle. All right, the last general class of tissue is nervous. And so there are some subtypes, but we're really not going to get into a lot of the subtypes and just stick with neurons and nervous tissue as one main category for this class. Where do you find nervous tissue? Of course, brain, spinal cord, nerves, all of the things that route through the body for our communication system, right? And so what is the function of nervous tissue? It's electrochemical communication, right? There's a very in-depth process using neurotransmitters that passes all our messages from our brain out toward our periphery, and then the messages from our periphery and our receptors all the way back to the brain for interpretation. All right, if you look at this micrograph of a neuron, you can see the shape of it here. This is a drawing. You may have seen these type drawings of neurons before as well. And you can see this individual cell kind of looks like a star shape with a larger body and nucleus. And then you sometimes see all these little string things, the axons or the dendrites extending from that larger spot. And then you see all this like dark purple and different things in between because the neurons are not packed tightly together. They're spread out so those axons and dendrites can connect from one cell to the next. We call these glial cells. They're support cells for the brain. And the nervous tissue, there's a lot of different subtypes of those. But you should be able to recognize nervous tissue by this kind of star-shaped, spread out, web-like kind of cells that are interspersed with lots of space and smaller support cells in between. All right, that covers muscle and nervous tissue, the subtypes of those and their locations in the body. Thanks for watching.